Hello and welcome everyone. Today we're doing another tier list for Deep Rock Galactic. This is going to be on the mutators because I haven't talked about the mutators in quite a while, since at least season 1. So since then we've gotten at least 2 new mutators to go over. So our new categories start out with Has 6. This is basically a mutator that ups the difficulty substantially. We have Pain, so it's going to be a pain one way or the other. We have Hard up next, so kind of difficult, but still pretty doable. Then we have Fine, which, you know, you don't really care one way or the other if it shows up on your mission types usually, at least for me. And then we have Not So Bad. So, you know, anything that's maybe a slight bump up in difficulty, and maybe not even a bump up in difficulty depending on what you take. We're going to start it off with Cave Leech Cluster. Cave Leech Cluster makes it so that there will be more Cave Leeches that spawn than normal, usually. Sometimes that's not true. Sometimes you get a Cave Leech Cluster and it has like 3 leeches in it for the entire mission. Other times you'll get a Cave Leech Cluster that has like 20 leeches in it, and sometimes you'll just get a standard match that has like 10 leeches in it regardless. You can counter this one pretty easily if you take Heightened Senses. That way you don't have to worry about getting grabbed at least twice. Certain builds are really strong against this too. Any AoE build is pretty strong, so if you like using the autocannon, if you like using bullet hell, magic bullets, fragmentation missiles with the hurricane, it can be a little bit rough maybe if you're playing like driller, where you're not always able to hit the ceiling with your primary weapon. Again, that depends on what you're using with the primary. And so long as you just remember to look up, it shouldn't be that bad overall. And I would say that Cave Leech Cluster is usually fine. I don't mind Cave Leech Cluster at all. Can be a little bit annoying at times, but I think for the most part it's fine. It's only when you forget that there's a Cave Leech Cluster to when it gets bad, or if you really insist on not taking Heightened Senses. Up next we have Elite Threat, which Elite Threat is quite a big step up compared to Cave Leech. This makes it so elite enemies can spawn. This can be random as to how many elite enemies spawn. These enemies are bigger, they hit harder, they have more health. They also seem to be less affected by stuns. I'm not entirely sure if that's fully true or not, but at least whenever I've seen them get stunned, they seem to just snap right out of it. And this can be really rough, especially if you get certain elite enemies. If you get an elite grabber, it's very scary because they will grab you pretty much instantly, and you don't really have much of a chance to counter that unless it's in a big open area. Elite slashers can do massive damage to you. Elite Praetorians and elite guards are extremely tanky. They just soak through bullets. You can even have an elite detonator, which is pretty scary. He's pretty tanky and will definitely kill you if he gets close. So depending on the mission type, Elite Threat can be very, very difficult and probably one of the hardest modifiers in the game. Now, I would say that this is either in the Pain category or it's in the Has 6 category, depending on the mission type and depending on when these decide to spawn. If it's something like an egg hunt or, let's say, a pipeline mission or something like that, where you can kind of take your time and do the objectives whenever you'd like, and you can deal with the bugs as they come, it's usually not that bad. It's usually more of on the Pain scale rather than on the Has 6 scale. However, if you're doing like a drill dozer mission, or you're doing a salvage mission, or you're doing an industrial sabotage mission, and you have elite enemies, all of those missions have spots where you have to defend. And if they start spawning there, it can be really rough. I remember one elite deep dive that I had that gave me 2 elite grabbers during a salvage mission, and it was when I was fixing the uplink, and I physically could not get back to the uplink because the place where I was fighting, they could just fly in through the wall, grab me, and then send me on the other side of the cave, and there was no counterplay to that unless I had Heightened Senses, which I did not because I wasn't expecting that to happen. In that case, it was definitely like a Has 6 bump up in difficulty, but I think I'm going to keep it in the high end of Pain, low end of Has 6. It's probably there. It really depends on the mission type that you get with this one. Up next, we have Exploder Infestation, and Exploder Infestation makes it so more exploders spawn than normal. This does not include detonators. Detonators are not considered an exploder, so if you just happen to get more detonators on those missions, I guess you just got unlucky. But Exploder Infestation also kind of depends on what mission you get. In certain missions, you really don't care about this. Again, if you're doing like an egg hunt where it's usually just kill all the bugs, who cares if there's more exploders? You're probably going to actually get value out of them then, and you'll probably be on the lookout for them. But on certain other mission types, they can be particularly hard. If it's on a drill dozer mission, it gets much more difficult when you have Exploder Infestation. Funny enough, though, if you get Exploder Infestation and Volatile Guts, they kind of cancel each other out because Volatile Guts triggers before the exploders would actually explode. So as long as they don't get right up next to you and then can explode, they shouldn't trigger. You can also kind of counter exploder infestation with a couple different weapons or different tactics. Shields are really good against them if you have a gunner, because they'll try to run away from the shield and then you can kill them safely from the outside of that. Freezing also works on them because if they're frozen, they can't explode. The microwave gun can also kill them without them exploding. Previously, you could do it with the sludge pump too, but that's since been changed to where you can't just dissolve them with the sludge pump. Exploder infestation goes, I think I'm going to put it in the fine tier as well. If it's on like a drill dozer mission, it's hard. Or on potentially an uplink mission, then it's hard. Or even on industrial sabotage, it could be hard. Most other missions, though, it's fine. If you get it on a point extract, it doesn't matter too much. If you get it on an egg hunt, it doesn't really matter that much, or a mining mission, or whatever it might be. So I think I'd put it in fine overall, but it could change categories depending on the mission type. Then we have Haunted Cave, which everybody really seems to hate Haunted Cave. Haunted Cave makes it so that there's a ghost detonator that shows up that cannot be injured and will constantly be trying to attack the dwarves. So it's going to try to focus on one person and constantly go after them. If it gets too close to anybody, it will explode. Doesn't do as much damage as a bulk detonator, but it still does really high damage to you. And it can be kind of annoying. It's especially annoying if you have objectives to do on the map, like defend an area, or if you're fighting a dreadnought. That can be pretty rough if you get Haunted Cave. Good news is that these can't spawn on salvage operations or on escort duties. But still, if you get them in like a deep dive and you're doing like a point extract, they can really harass you quite a bit, and it can be very annoying. If you're playing Scout, Haunted Cave really isn't that big of a deal because you just have the most mobility, so you can get away from it without too much trouble. You can also use slowdowns on the ghost detonator as well. So if you have an IFG, if you have the sludge pump, if you have electricity, you can slow it down with all of those effects, which is pretty nice. And so long as this is your only modifier and the cave is at least fairly open, it's usually, I would say, probably in the fine tier. But with how annoying it can be, especially on certain mission types, I would put it in the hard tier, maybe bordering on the pain tier. Because sometimes the ghost detonator just makes missions take way, way longer than they ever should. And not in really a fun way to where you actually feel like you're doing stuff. It's usually you're kiting the detonator to one side of the cave so you can run around and do whatever the objective is on the other side of the cave. Which again, if you're playing Scout, not a big deal. But if you're playing like solo gunner, it can be pretty rough. If you're playing solo Ingi, it can be pretty rough. Driller, not as bad because you can drill your way to freedom, safety, wherever you want to go. Next up, we have Lethal Enemies, which Lethal Enemies I'm absolutely going to put in Has 6. Lethal Enemies ups the difficulty quite a bit, especially in certain biomes that are already difficult, especially if you get a lot of Swarmers. Swarmers are very scary with Lethal Enemies attached to them. So this makes it so all melee damage from any of the bugs is doubled. That's really bad, especially if you get hit by a slasher. It is not uncommon to get 2-shot by a slasher on Has 5 if you're playing with Lethal Enemies. It's really not uncommon to get swarmed and eaten extremely fast by Swarmers, or just getting destroyed by big things like Oppressors or Praetorians if they decide to smack you. It can all be pretty scary with Has 6 on there, mostly because the thing that you're fighting most of the time is melee enemies. You're not really fighting ranged enemies too often, unless you just happen to get a bunch of Mactera or something. Up next, we have low O2, or low oxygen. This one is just annoying, I would say. This one ranges from not so bad to very painful, depending on the mission type, and depending on, well, just the team and how you guys like to play, because it forces everybody to stay together, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but that can slow down missions overall, and you have to stay near Molly, or you have to keep going back to the rigs in order to get oxygen. On point extract, low O2 can be particularly annoying because you have to venture out, get some Quarks, come back and put it away, and make sure you get air. So every time you go out and don't find something and then have to come back, this is especially rough if you're playing like solo gunner, where you just don't have the most mobility, especially if things are high up and you have to use your zip lines to get up there. It can slow down the mission a lot. And if you do run out of oxygen, you do start dying. It starts taking away your health right away. That can be pretty bad. You can kind of help this if you end up getting a bunch of nitra and you can just keep dropping resupplies. That way, at least you can make kind of a chain to go from one to the next to the next. That does help, but I don't know. Low O2, I'm going to put it in the pain tier just because it can be so annoying at times. But on certain missions, it's really not that bad. So it can range anywhere from here to there. It really depends on the mission. Then we have Mactera Plague. Mactera Plague makes it so Mactera are more likely to spawn than anything else. This depends on your build as to how difficult this is going to be. It's usually the most difficult if you didn't plan for this and you find it on a deep dive or something. If you see it in a normal mission, you can plan ahead. You can go with, if you go with like Snowball with the cryo cannon, you'll clear up the entire swarm, no problem. Same if you go with cryo grenades with Scout. They're not so bad. It's just once you get a bunch of like Tri-Jaws that spawn as to when they can be really rough, or you get grabbers that just keep coming through the walls, or you just get like a really bad map setup for whatever your loadout is. Maybe the Mactera stay really far away and just keep spitting at you. That can be particularly rough. So Mactera, I think I'd put them in the pain tier. They can be pretty rough. If you build for them, they're not as bad. You could also take heightened senses for this, so grabbers aren't as big a deal. But if you get a fairly open cave and there's just a bunch of goo bombers and there's a bunch of Tri-Jaws, they slow you down so much, and then the Tri-Jaws just keep sniping at you until you're dead. Next, we have Parasites. Parasites is not bad. I'm going to put this one right into the not bad tier. This one I don't mind seeing whatsoever. The worst that's going to happen is that the Parasites are going to take a little bit of extra ammo to kill. And that's like the worst case scenario. Maybe they'll do a little bit of damage to you, but if you're like me and you constantly run thorns, it's no big deal at all. This makes it so whenever an enemy is killed, it will spit out larvae. This depends on the size of the enemy as to how many larvae they spit out. If it's regular grunts, they'll spit out 1. If it's something as big as Praetorians, then they will spit out 3. And certain other enemy types just won't spawn parasites at all. So swarmers and jellyfish and stuff won't spawn swarmers. You can kill the swarmers pretty easy. They don't move around very fast. They don't do very much damage. If they do hit you, you can just swing your pickaxe and kill them, or you can use any AoE weapon. So if you're using gunner, basically any of your primary weapons, or driller, basically any of your primary weapons. Even if you don't choose to kill the parasites, they'll die anyway over time. They just have a limited amount of life on them. So if they're on the other end of the cave, you don't even need to worry about them a lot of the time. Just keep on going to do whatever you were trying to do, and they'll usually die. Parasites are probably one of the easiest. Regenerative bugs is also probably fine. I don't really have a problem with regenerative bugs most of the time. It can be annoying on certain enemies. What regenerative bugs does is it makes it so any bug that hasn't been injured in a bit, as well as robots, it counts towards robots too for some reason. If they haven't been injured in a bit, then they will start regenerating their health. A lot of the time this isn't a huge deal because you can just keep shooting the same bug until it's dead, and that's usually what you're going to be doing anyway. It only becomes a problem when there's like a mix of bugs and you're trying to switch back and forth between targets. It can be annoying if an oppressor's in there because you might ignore the oppressor until the end, at which case then he's back up to full health and he's just going to be a bullet sponge. It can also be annoying with menaces since they tend to run away a lot. So if you don't kill them quickly, they can burrow, get back their health, show up again, and just keep annoying you. That can be pretty annoying too. And again, with the robots, it can be a little bit annoying as well if you don't kill them right away. Everything else, not really much of a buff to them. You can kill them pretty quick, and any sort of damage over time effect stops them from healing too. So if you're running electricity, or if you're running neurotoxin rounds, or running fire, or whatever it might be, any of those make it so regenerative bugs aren't that bad. It also counts towards Steve. Steve gets all the bonuses of regenerative bugs too, which is really good if you like the perk Beastmaster, because then you can get a slasher Steve, and he's basically as tanky as a grunt Steve, but he just deals an insane amount more damage. You could also take it with a grunt Steve, and then he's basically never going to die for the mission unless he tries to fight an oppressor one-on-one or something. And even then, if you help him, he's probably still going to win and out-survive that. Or maybe if there's like a detonator or a bunch of exploders. Those would be about the only things that would kill Steve. Steve also has parasites if you get him on the parasite mission, but the parasites don't fight for you. They still attack you after he dies. Steve also gets benefits from lethal enemies. So Steve suddenly becomes way scarier towards all the bugs, especially a slasher Steve. He will kill basically anything super quick on the lethal enemies. Should have mentioned that. There was also a way to get an elite Steve. You can't do it anymore. It's been bugged twice, I believe, where you could get an elite Steve. You had to use the overclock reatomizer to do it. And it also made it so you could make anything an elite enemy, which was kind of scary because you had to be careful with it then. But there was a way where you could make an elite Steve if you had an elite enemy, had Steve on the other side of it, and shot through the elite enemy and hit Steve with your reatomizer. It would transfer the status from the elite enemy to Steve, and then he would be an elite Steve. I kind of wish that was still in the game, but it did make Steve kind of overpowered because then he was super tanky, hit super hard. All right, up next we have Shield Disruption, and Shield Disruption I'm also going to put up into the Has 6 difficulty. Shield Disruption is really rough. Shield Disruption takes away your shield entirely throughout the entirety of the mission. that's pretty rough because there's a lot of times where you're just going to be taking chip damage from your shield and not really care about it, from falls to just tanking through like swarmers to tanking through a few grunt hits. And you can't really do that with shield disruption. Every little bit of damage stacks up over time. There is more red sugar that spawns here, and health perks definitely help on shield disruption. So if you like running Sweet Tooth or Resupplier or Vampire, all of those can help mitigate shield disruption, but it's still going to be one of the most difficult things because you're missing that 25 to 30 health that you usually have that constantly regenerates. You don't have that anymore, and that can be pretty rough at times. So definitely a bump up in difficulty there. Then we have Swarmageddon. Swarmageddon, I'm going to put into the hard difficulty. Swarmageddon really depends on the class that you're playing. If you're playing like full AoE autocannon gunner, then Swarmageddon isn't a big deal at all. Same with if you're running like full sticky flamethrower on Driller. Who cares then? They're all going to die super quick. But if you're playing, M1000 Scout with Zukovs or something like that, you're not running cryo mindlets, it can be kind of rough. It can be kind of a pain. Swarmers can do a lot of damage per second. They can also eat through a decent amount of bullets too, depending on the class. Again, if you build for it and you know ahead of time that you're going on it, it's usually not that bad because you can build for AoE. You can do that on any class. You can go aggressive venting on Scout or impact deflection or cryo mindlets, something like that. You can go anything on Gunner and Driller basically for primary weapons. And you could go with something like, full AoE grenade launcher for Inji and not have too much trouble overall. If it wasn't obvious, Swarmageddon just makes more swarmers, so they can spawn in, and these are separate to other swarms, similar to Exploder Infestation and similar to the next one that we're going to talk about, which is Rival Presence. These can spawn in at any time. They're not tied to the regular enemy swarms that are coming in. So next up we have Rival Presence, and if this was last season, I would immediately say Rival Presence has 6, and there's probably a good precedent for it. I think I'm still going to put it up in has 6 because it is pretty rough at times. It really depends on the spawn and the location, but even ignoring that, just the fact that you can have separate spawns that show up aside from the normal bug spawns that are showing up throughout a mission, having an additional robot spawn on top of that just makes it even worse than it was before, because this can be shredder drones, which can do a pretty good amount of damage to you and can be a little bit tankier than most of the other flying enemies. You can get the patrol bots, which were a lot worse in the previous season, where they were just super tanky and could do a lot of damage to you and moved around erratically. They've since been nerfed, so they're not as bad as they used to be, but they're still pretty rough. You can get the turrets, which usually aren't a big deal. It kind of depends on the room that you're in, depending on how bad the turrets are and also what gear you're taking. There are certain ways to counter them. Any high single target damage weapon works really well against the robots. Fire can kill the robots pretty quick. Ice got better against the robots. This also increases the chance that Nemesis will spawn. Nemesis has a chance of spawning on every mission, but this makes it so he's more likely to show up, which Nemesis is kind of a bullet sponge too, depending on what you're using. And then the last modifier that was added this season is the Lithiphage outbreak. And the Lithiphage outbreak used to actually be a little bit more difficult to do in the beta than it is now, because in the beta you could have more contagion spikes than you do currently. Right now you can only have a max of 3, but I think in the beta you could have up to 5. And this actually changes the mission overall because it gives you another primary objective that you have to do, which I find pretty interesting. It can be a little bit annoying depending on the mission setup, more the cave setup as to where it is. If they're in big open areas, they're no big deal whatsoever. They're just a little bit time consuming. If they're in really hard to reach places, they can be a lot worse to actually, get done unless you're playing Scout or something, in which case it's usually not that bad regardless. This also spawns in more Rockpox enemies. Rockpox enemies can be pretty tanky. Depending on what weapon you're using, they can be killed pretty easily or take a few more shots than normal. They're not insane bullet sponges though. So this is going to just add a little bit more annoyance to the mission and a little bit more time to the mission overall. But I honestly don't mind the Lithiphage outbreak. I would probably put it in the fine tier. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a tier list that actually had the Lithiphage outbreak, so we're just going to stick it right there. It might look a little bit different compared to the other ones, but it's right there. And I think this is where I'd put all the mutators as of Season 3. There are some pretty rough ones. It honestly can depend more on the map type or the class that you like playing than the actual mutator itself. Thanks for watching this. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Tell me where you would put these mutators. I'm really interested to hear that. And I will talk to you guys next time. Take care and bye-bye.